Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to another episode of Thinking Out Loud. Today we're speaking with Peter Boghossian. He's a PhD in philosophy at Portland State University. We talk about whether or not morality can be objective and the cultural landscape in general. There's an interesting question here on whether or not pronouns in your bio is more of a political position than an act of solidarity with the LGBT community. While I disagree with him and think that people generally have them for the sake of wanting to show support, I think his reasoning is interesting and is certainly part of the equation. We have a very fruitful conversation, and it was an honor to have him on. Be sure to go check him out. He's absolutely brilliant. And I also want to mention that there's now a Twitter account for the podcast. It's at BPTOLcast. You can also follow my personal Twitter at Latent Physicist. We also have merch available, so if you're interested in a mug, sticker, shirt, or whatever, check out the link in the description of the video below. Anyways, hope you enjoy the video. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to another episode of Thinking Out Loud. As always, I'm your host, Vincent Freeman, and I'm joined by my good friend Bruce. Bruce, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Very excited to be here today, especially since we have a special guest.
That's right. Our special guest today is none other than Dr. Peter Boghossian, who very kindly told us to refer to himself as Peter. So, Peter, thank you for coming on the podcast.
My pleasure, Vincent. Bruce, nice to talk to you guys. And you had mentioned that we met earlier.
Well, Peter, you and I have. We actually met a few years ago when you were down here at the San Diego Skeptic Society. And our mutual friend, Jamie Ian Swiss, introduced you, and you gave a talk centering about woke culture, about how to have civil conversations.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So, all right, that situates it. Yeah, Jamie's a good friend of mine. And you mentioned that you have a brown belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu.
Yeah, I've been training towards my black belt, hopefully, just taking a lot of private lessons, trying to put the effort into conditioning. Just martial arts is a big part of my life, and I was really hoping to make some substantial gains this year. But then the coronavirus hit, and we've pretty much been out of training for a long period of time, and that no longer seems to be a realistic goal for this year. But we'll just have to wait it out and see what happens, because we deal with the circumstances as they come.
It's a good attitude. There's absolutely no question about it. That is the number one, number two, and number three hardest things for me. The most difficult thing is jiu-jitsu is just my release, and it's my, when someone's trying to choke you, as you don't really think about your day or whatever else is going on in your life. So I'm sorry about that.
No, it's cool.
All right. So I suppose a good way to start the podcast would be having a conversation about one of the things that you're well known for, and that is the conversation of morality. I recently saw your podcast that you did with Reid from Cordial Curiosity, in which you sort of tried to justify an objective moral sense via the veil of ignorance. So I first want to ask you specifically, how are we defining morality? I know that's a very broad question, but I think for the sake of familiarizing my audience with the topic of morality, we first need to define it, if that's all right.
Yeah, sure. My mentor used to say, whenever I asked him, Frank Wesley was his name, whenever I asked him to define a word or, what's the difference between bravery and courage or what have you, he'd say to me something like, he's an old German guy, German Jew, them just words. I would say the simplest definition of that is it's just what one ought to do. Mm-hmm. And it goes back to Socrates' question of what type of life ought one to lead.
Okay, that's a pretty good definition. And you sort of established the fact that we can reason our way into moral facts, right? Is that a correct thing to say?
I believe that's the case, but you need to step back further from that and say, are there moral facts? And what is a moral fact? And if you can come to an agreement, so a moral fact is just as there are empirical facts about the world, I've walked so many paces today, or the earth is so many feet or meters from the sun at a given time point. Just as there are facts about empirical phenomena, so too are there facts about moral phenomena. So that's a moral fact. And then the question is, if there are moral facts, then there are only so many responses. Either you can reason to them or you can't reason to them. And then the next one is a little bizarre, but you can reason to them, but not with our current cognitive architecture. You need some kind of a super intelligent AI to figure them out. But
Mm-hmm.
just bracket that for a moment, because that's a whole nother discussion. So if there are moral facts, then it is my, after having thought about this for a long, long time, it is my sincerely held opinion that they can be reasoned to.
Okay. And if that's the case, well, one of the foundations there is the ability to reason. And Donald Hoffman talked about this in his book, The Case Against Reality. And so this is something that's been on my mind recently. If our ability to reason is nothing more than a byproduct of evolution that gave us an advantage, how do we know that evolution instilled upon us the ability to accurately understand reality, the ability that we call reason?
Wow, there was a lot going on in that question. So, yeah. Okay, so I guess you'd start with a building block or a rudiment. Do you think that we can reason to, ameliorate dental pain? Well, yeah, because we already have. We Novocaine and, not to go down a rabbit hole, but when I was a kid, the dentist looked at my mouth before this pandemic started and said, wow, last time you had, dental work done, it was in the Stone Age. I'm like, oh, fucking great. But yeah, so we can figure things out. So reason has an instrumental value. It's like an instrument that yields certain conclusions or that enables us to achieve certain things. Now, that's just, I don't know how that could be disputed. Habermas calls that a performative contradiction, that you'd use reason to disable reason. But if you can admit that, then the next question becomes, well, where does the ought come in? What should we do? Should we help people live without dental pain, or should we make more people live with dental pain, or does dental pain have nothing to do with the moral calculus? So it seems to me to be blatantly obvious that we can use reason as a tool to achieve certain ends. The more complicated question is, what ought those ends to be?
Right. And that's the complicated question that I'm hoping to explore a bit, because I completely agree with everything that you've said so far. The only thing that brings me pause is the fact that there has to be that assumption that we ought to want what's best for humanity or increase the well-being of society. How do you get rid of this is and ought distinction that David Hume proposed?
Yeah, all right. So there's a lot of people have written about that rather extensively. Searle.
Oh, God, yeah.
Yeah, so John Searle says, I am a barber. What ought I to do? I ought to cut hair. It's a very simple syllogism dismantling the is ought. A lot of people have picked up that mantle. Harris picked it up in The Moral Landscape. Shermer picked it up and has been talking about it recently. Michael Shermer from Skeptic and presidential fellow at Chapman University. He's picked it up recently in The Moral Arc. There's a podcast that he's done. So I think that you have to start by agreeing upon some basic definitions, like you asked me what morality was. And I mean, we could do that, or I mean, I'm completely fluid to go wherever you want to take the conversation.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that sounds good. Yeah, so the is and not distinction is one that certainly put me stumbling on that, and I've tried to get around it. So I've tried to use sort of, as you mentioned, Sam Harris's sort of way to tackle it, where he says that it's an illusion. But it's difficult for me to get around it because no matter how hard I think about it, it seems to me that we're always relying upon a judgment that is based on the existence of conscious minds. If you were to get rid of all conscious minds on the planet, and then you ask a question like, you look at two rocks, well, what are the moral implications of these two rocks? It's just a nonsensical question. So by definition, it had to be subjective, right?
What has to be subjective?
The whole point of morality, the whole claim that our moral intuitions come strictly from the mind, and you can't get them from the fabric of the universe.
What do you mean by come directly from the mind, as opposed to what?
So, for instance, if Well, I suppose I should put it this way then. If two people say that that their favorite color is blue, and you keep increasing the number until finally you have the majority of the people that say their favorite color is blue, it doesn't make it objective that blue is the best color. It just simply makes it a sort of democratic consensus popularity contest. And if we admit that that is an opinion, and we say the same thing about moral values, well, most people agree that the whole point of morality is to increase the well-being of society, then wouldn't we have to apply the same level of logic?
No, that's the fallacy. It has nothing to do with morality. And you mentioned my podcast with Reid, Nice Wonder. He's a great guy, by the way. But I gave just one of many examples. I gave the example of John Rawls. And Rawls is operating, I don't know how philosophical you want to get, but he's operating in the Kantian tradition. And he says that he's a deontologist. If I get too much into the weeds, let me know. But he proposes a thought experiment. And a thought experiment is, let's say you don't know your position in society and you're behind a veil of ignorance. So you don't know if you're going to be gay, tall, black, or what have you. In other words, you have to pick your place in society as if your enemy assigns you your social role. That has absolutely nothing to do with subjectivity. In fact, it can't have anything to do with subjectivity, because the whole point of the thought experiment is to remove subjectivity from the equation to show that you can rationally derive certain moral principles. And in this case, he argues that there are two principles that one could derive, two systems of social and economic justice that one could derive. So I think that that's an incredibly powerful device to enable us to understand that the morality is not subjective and that it can be reasoned to just through thought experiments.
I'd like to jump in here actually for a little bit. Doctor, I've seen some of your lectures in the past, and from what I've seen from them, I'm assuming you're not a moral relativist like I am. I believe you're right. Yeah, I also have my personal moral beliefs are that that I tend towards the idea that morality is objective, but I just have a hard time convincing myself of that. I've read Sam Harris's Moral Landscape, and along with the disparities in moral systems that we see today, I've really shifted my views over to being a moral objectivist. But speaking for myself from a confidence level, I'm only around 70% on board because of the naturalistic fallacy. And for our listeners who aren't familiar with it, it's the idea that's because something is the way it is in nature, it doesn't immediately follow that a course of action has to come from it. This is David Hume's is-ought distinction. However, I raised my level of confidence recently because I've been researching Peter Singer's book, and he has a principle in which he calls the principle of impartial consideration of interests, in which he argues that moral reasoning can't favor a philosophy like the strong will survive, lest someone of superior strength come and just mow down the person who just made the statement originally. And I think the bottom line is like if we were able to inquire about from all living organisms, most of them by default don't want to be harmed, enslaved, or tortured or mistreated, what have you. In that general sense, it makes sense to me because it makes sense to me, but I can't quite sell it to myself because that feels like an extension of the naturalistic fallacy. But if we take another one of Hume's axioms, in which custom is how we define a repetition of events and natural phenomena through life, then I think there's a strong argument to be made that by default, most living beings don't want to be subject to torture or any of these other items. So from that basis, there seems to be some kind of reasoning for some kind of rational basis of morality, but I'm just not so sure that it's objective at the extremes.
And by objective, you mean maybe we mean two different things by objective. By objective, I know Vincent said built into the fabric of the universe or something like that about the fabric of the universe.
Yeah.
What I mean by objective is, okay, so I mean that it's rationally derivable. Charles Sanders Peirce, the American philosopher, has this idea of an ideal community of inquirers, and that there is a God's eye view, or a way to step back from personal, cultural, situated circumstance and make judgments about things. Now, this is very, very, very complicated, obviously, because those judgments have to be subject to revision, which is what formulating your beliefs on the basis of evidence and reason means. Those judgments have to be. I love the idea of just thinking about dividing a bag of pot when we were kids. The person who divides the bag of pot doesn't get to choose which side he has, right? So that's a really simple way to ensure fairness, or ice cream if you don't like pot, or pizza or whatever. But
Right.
The divider is never the chooser. So that principle alone guarantees fairness. And Rawls and others have said, and I believe this, that justice is fairness. Now, that's what I mean when I say objective. I mean these things are rationally derivable. You can use the principles of reason to do so.
And from that aspect, we have at least the basis for a rational approach to ethics, which that's grounded in objective fact.
That's correct. And so,
Okay.
I mean, I can argue against that if you want, but that's the basic idea.
Do you think the problem is that we sort of expect more from a science of morality than we do with other disciplines? For instance, in the Department of Health, we sort of just take it as an axiomatic truth that being healthy is good and being unhealthy is bad, and we refer to health as objective because we know what constitutes healthy and unhealthy. Same thing could be said, for instance, with the problem of induction, where we sort of just take it on principle that tomorrow is going to be the same as today. Do you think people just expect too much?
I don't know if they expect too much. I think that I don't want to say their priors, are different, but I think that it's less so that their expectations, but more so that their cultural and historical circumstance gives them a kind of myopia, a kind of moral myopia, in which they think that whatever their culture has happened to have latched onto is some timeless and objective truth, even if those very same people claim that they don't believe in timeless and objective truth. So I think that it's less about expectation, although that may seem to play a part. A colleague of mine said to me many years ago when I taught at the University of Portland, he said he hates teaching ethics. And I asked him why, and he said that most people think they're already moral experts. And I think that's right. Whereas if you were to ask most people, they wouldn't think they're experts in jiu-jitsu. They wouldn't think that they're experts in, playing the piano or speaking Swahili. And that's because there's something to be wrong about, right? That's because there's a corrective mechanism intrinsic in those. And the question is, what's the corrective mechanism intrinsic in morality? And so just as an example, some guy thinks that he has some, woo-woo he can do. And, he's 180 pounds and he believes he can knock people out without touching them. You can go to YouTube and see tons of videos on this. Well, okay, we just adjudicate that by throwing him in a cage with an MMA fighter. And, okay. And if he's right, we say, holy shit, then we start using it, right? Then we pick it up and study from the guy. But they're always wrong. They're always wrong. So there are ways to adjudicate empirical claims that, is there such a thing as moral expertise? In the same way there is such a thing as, piano expertise. It's one way to think about the question of moral expertise and objective morality.
I see.
Huh. That's interesting. And do you think that's I had this argument with my friend, I think a year back, and this was on the topic of veganism and whether or not we should extend our circle of empathy to include animals. And he said that if you could convince me that humanity would be better off if everyone went vegan, then I would become a vegan. But as of right now, because my moral intuitions say that I only do what is what would selfishly increase my pleasure, and being vegan would not increase my pleasure; it would decrease my pleasure. And that is more powerful of a feeling than the pleasure I get from everybody else feeling pleasure. Then therefore, I will not go vegan.
Yeah, got it. So I would ask him why he thinks he should trust his moral intuitions.
Hmm. That's interesting. What do you think? I actually don't know your stance on veganism. Do you think that we should extend well-being to animals?
That's a great question. I've thought about it a lot. I wouldn't want to say vegetarian, but I mean, I'll tell you how I've answered this dilemma, and I'm not advocating this for anybody else, but I don't eat factory farmed meat. The whole process itself, even if they're free range chickens or what have you, it's still pretty ghastly. I've had a change of mind as I've extended that umbrella of kindness to sentient creatures, particularly those I eat. I'll say in complete candor, during the pandemic, I'm immunocompromised, so I can't go into stores or anything. So I grabbed my kids to go and made them go in. But they bought pork, and I hadn't eaten factory farm pork in whenever. And so that presented me with kind of because I couldn't let it go to waste. I didn't feel right about eating it, not from any karmic point of view, like I was going to be punished as a consequence, but there's something I do think now, I've changed my mind about that. I do think that there's sufficient evidence to warrant belief that the umbrella of just humane treatment should be extended to sentient creatures.
Mm-hmm. Do you know who Armin Navabi is?
Know the name, don't know him.
Okay, yeah. So he's the founder of Atheist Republic, and I had a debate with him about this because I'm not a vegan yet, but I'm on the route to becoming one because I think it's becoming increasingly more and more difficult to justify eating meat. And he said that he would become a vegan if it were to be proven that animals were self-aware enough to the point where they can actually enjoy life. So he recognizes that they feel pain, they feel suffering, and they feel euphoria at times, but he doesn't recognize that they're self-aware of themselves. What do you think about that argument?
Well, I'm curious as to why that's the line in the sand.
Mm-hmm.
All these questions are always epistemological questions. And so the problem is that many people put their morality ahead of their epistemology, and particularly their metaphysics ahead of their epistemology. And just as a brief parenthetical, we've seen in the last few years that metaphysics aren't as important as we thought that they were in Culture War 2.0. I wrote a piece about that in the American Mind. But I think epistemological questions have to take priority. And what that would look like is, okay, so what would it take? And his take, well, enjoy your life, or self-conscious, or, if you to suffer, you can't just feel pain in one moment. You have to have a concept of time. And so you have to realize that there was a time out of the pain. And, I don't know why that would be the argument for whether that's a sufficient reason to eat or not eat meat. So I guess there are many epistemological questions that have to come before that to understand the reasoning.
Okay, so you mentioned Culture War 2.0, so I suppose that's a good way to navigate the direction of this conversation towards the topic of wokeness. So, Bruce, why don't you go ahead and start us off there?
Yes, Doctor. When we met a while back in San Diego, you gave a talk on how to have productive conversations, and part of the conversation drifted over into the discussion of woke culture, which is doing a number in our society today. One of the questions I want to ask is, where are we in terms of wokeness? People seem to be waking up to varying degrees. I've noticed that a criticism of conservative Islam doesn't quite seem to be off the table anymore. We've seen circumstances such as what happened in Birmingham, UK, in which moderate to conservative Muslim groups were protesting against LGBT teachings, all the while claiming not to be homophobic. And the UK schools this time just absolutely refusing to cave to their protests. so there's definitely pushback coming up against cultural relativism, but I'm concerned that's not nearly enough. There's a lot of conversations to be had on subjects that touch upon race, ethnicity, culture that we have to actually have an adult and ethically responsible conversation about, but we seem to be a long ways away from that. And I see this. I'm a liberal myself. I'm my home is in the Bay Area, and it's maddening to see the infestation going on there. The teaching wokeness, intersectionality in my old high school, and I just why people seem to be waking up to a degree, but it's in shades. What's your take on this, and how do we, as genuine liberals, recover from this kind of toxicity?
Geez, another massive question. Honestly, that's one of the few questions. I don't even know where to begin with that. Okay, so you guys are actually making me think. Making me think here. That's good.
It's supposed to be fun.
So I'm actually looking at the ground when I'm walking because you guys are making me think. Usually I never think about anything. Okay, so here's the question we have. What is wokeness? So I think we should probably define that. We should probably define our terms when we talk about social justice ideology. We should probably talk about the genesis of that and what it looks like. But I'll try to give an answer based upon the evidence I have. So the social justice ideology, and we've defined that as placing grievances, particularly grievances about sex and race and gender, pushing those to the fore in one's way of navigating life's complexities. Jonathan Haidt also talks about victim culture. We have seen social justice ideology seep out of colleges, and Peterson says, I can't remember if Peterson said this or I said this, someone said this, it's about 5 to 7 years between the time that students are taught and by the time they go to the workforce and we see the manifestation of the ideology.
Right.
Lyle Asher from Lewis and Clark has a fundamental, really good piece of this puzzle when he talks about it coming from colleges of education. So colleges of education indoctrinate their professors into teaching. The school system you need a teaching certificate by law. So it varies by state and charter schools, et cetera. But that ideology is based upon almost exclusively Paulo Freire, who's a Brazilian educator, pedagogy of the oppressed. And so we have colleges of education in pre-service teacher education programs indoctrinating teachers who then teach our kids. We have grievance studies departments, basically pretty much anything with the word studies in it, who are teaching people to look for grievances in everything. They've taken over the tech sector. Think about James Damore and the Google memo. They've taken over media, comedy. Think about the stuff Joe Rogan's put out, and think about the fairly recent Bill Burr and Dave Chappelle comedy shows. They've taken over arts and entertainment. They are winning the culture war. There's simply no question about it. Now, that's why I said this is a huge question. Why hasn't anybody said, hey, I'm curious about the people researching the vaccine. I want to know how many trans people are on the vaccination research committees. I refuse to take it unless there's a trans person on it. I personally haven't heard that. So that, to me, whenever I hear something like, oh, we have a diversity requirement in our, for example, the philosophy department, that tells me that the thing that they have a diversity requirement for doesn't matter. I just saw they want to get, I know nothing about football, literally nothing. So I'll preface it by saying this, like nothing. I know they throw a ball, and there are a bunch of people on a team, nothing. I've never seen more than 5 minutes of a football game in my life. So please do not ask me about football. But I was reading this thing about NFL coaches or NFL team owners, and if they hire black coaches, they're going to give them first draft picks. So that tells me that they don't think that black coaches are going to be as good as white coaches. because if they did, they wouldn't need to compensate that for winning. So anytime you have a concern, an exogenous concern, something other than winning, you have to make up for that somehow, right? So we see the manifestations of this across the board, and we see it's basically a thug boot to the face of meritocracy. So both the right and the left have screwed this up. The reason the right has screwed this up, in my opinion, is because this narrative that, oh, you should just pick yourself up by your own bootstraps, and I worked hard, my parents are immigrants, or, you know, if everybody works hard, you can get ahead. Yeah, okay, that's obviously, there's nothing wrong with that. But the problem is that there are unequal distributions through no fault of anyone's. Like a young kid, you know, and John Rawls talks about this, to speak about John Rawls again, that everyone should be entitled to a public education of the first rate. So when we look at woke culture, for example, we see the manifestations of woke culture everywhere, ripping apart the society, and it's incredibly divisive. But we have different solutions on the right and the left for the problem. It was a long answer, and I put a lot in there, but your question was just a massive question.
I don't imagine it's an easy one to answer.
That's a good way to start, you know. Oh, go ahead, Bruce.
Go ahead, Vincent. Go ahead.
And I wanted to ask you specifically about this because one of the good indicators of determining whether or not someone is woke is generally viewed as whether or not they have pronouns in their bio. And you recently put your pronouns in your bio as a joke, but I want to steelman the opposition as much as possible here. So putting aside the seeming case that pronouns increase the likelihood of insufferability, and it's the general case, is the general case for pronouns not simply being in solidarity with the trans community or with non-binary people?
No, that has absolutely nothing to do with it whatsoever. It's not even a proxy for it. It's totally unrelated. It is not when someone has pronouns in their bio, we should probably define what we mean, he, him, she, her, zer, what have you. When someone has pronouns, and not only if they have pronouns in bio, where they are in their bio. Is it the first thing? Is it their last thing? Which reminds me, I should probably change to the first thing. But that's not a statement of one's identity. That's a political statement. That's a virtue signaling statement. That's a statement that you subscribe to an ideology. That's why people put pronouns in their bios. It's a marker.
Uh-huh. You don't think that there's anybody out there who genuinely just wants to support the LGBT community?
I do. I'm sure they do. Why would you put pronouns in your bio?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, look, think about it this way. Let's say I gave you a wand. I want you to, not you, but I'm giving you the person steelman in the argument of wand. I think Lindsay and I wrote about this in our book, my last book, How to Have Impossible Conversations. And you wave that wand, and you can do one of two things. You can get rid of transphobia, the irrational fear of trans people, or you can get rid of anthropogenic global warming. Which do you do?
Well, global warming.
Okay, so that's an utter no-brainer. But yet when I've asked people that question, I've had people actually think about it, and I've had a shocking number of people tell me, I usually say racism, not the trans issue. But the question is, what does it tell you about somebody's moral priorities and practical priorities when they put pronouns in their bios? And why is it that the people who put pronouns in their bios invariably, and I mean without exception, are the nastiest, most just unbelievably vitriolic? Now, why would that be?
Yeah, I mean, you could criticize their moral priorities, but at the same time, people also sort of have very laser-focused sort of, I suppose, specialties in what they choose to be activists about. So, for instance, you're an activist in the atheist community. Someone could have just as easily said, well, there are more important topics out there to talk about rather than atheism. So why are you focused on atheism? Couldn't you just extend the same level of thought that you put into your...
Well, my argument for that would be that that atheism, or it's not, atheism isn't about atheism, it's about epistemology. And it's about and I argued this in my first book and subsequent articles, and it's about cleaning up your epistemology. And when people use a faulty epistemology, they come to faulty conclusions that hurt us all. For example, I think a great example, a timely example now, is people who gather in churches. You know, the whole Christianity of the 80s, God, homosexuality was a punishment for homosexual sin of homosexual activity. Now we know that the COVID pandemic is obliterating Christian communities, and partially because they are refusing to not congregate. So they're still congregating. So the point about atheism was that it's about epistemology, which hints at deeper values which affect us all. It's unclear that that's the case with trans ideology. It's not to say that it's not justifiable or it's not good. And to be absolutely perfectly clear, because I know people are going to cut this conversation and then accuse me of all sorts of things, I completely emphatically support people over 18 to transition to any gender they want and go by literally any pronoun they want.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm. If it were the case, though, that having pronouns in your bio was nothing more than being in solidarity with the trans community, and it didn't have all this baggage that it does have with it being associated with the left, because as we all know that, you know, there's a huge PR problem that is occurring right there. But if we're strictly...
Stop you. Sorry, I'm breaking my own rule and interrupting. I have to stop you. But it's not the case. It's not the case because invariably the people who put pronouns in their bios are savaging people online. They're calling them racists and rapists and Nazis. So I can't buy that question because it's not the case. Therefore, that's like if you constructed that as a syllogism, that would be the premise. It's a counterfactual, but that's just not true. So whatever conclusion you come to wouldn't follow.
So what the theory of intersectionality, the general idea that different categorizations of social and political identities can cause different levels of discrimination, would it work in a vacuum?
What do you mean by working in a vacuum?
So right now you could make the argument that people are over-prescribing the idea of intersectionality, where they're putting people's identities right above everything. For instance, as you said, rather than be focused on the meritocracy, we're focusing on people's identities more than anything. But just generally speaking, without all the sort of PR problem baggage, is intersectionality a correct theory of socialization? Like, is someone who is a black bi...
Yeah, I don't think it's a theory. I think it's a heuristic. And I think if you want... It may be an explanatory mechanism to explain in Kimberly Crenshaw's original piece. It may be a explanatory mechanism to explain why black women, for example, experience proportionally more discrimination than black men or white women. But I think that the solution, and Helen Pluckrose has written about this in AREO magazine quite eloquently, the solution, and even better heuristic, is liberalism, is equality and not equity.
Mm-hmm.
Which actually, just parenthetically, gets back to my original point of providing everybody with a public education of the first rate and treating everybody with decency and focusing on equality of opportunity and not equality of outcome.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that's the type of society that we want to reach, right? And it's a matter of, well...
That ought to be the goal. That ought to be the ideal, yes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, what I've always wondered is the fact that sort of these games that the intersectional people play, that you can play this with just about every metric you can think of. I mean, we can do it with short people. On average, short people are discriminated more so than tall people. They have less dating prospects. But it's such a poor way of going about life. And especially if the end goal is, as you said, just general liberalism, that's not the way that we ought to go.
So let's linger on that for a moment. So yeah, okay. So short people have been discriminated against historically, etc. So then, to remediate that injustice, all short people in the future, we have to compensate for the sins of our fathers, to paraphrase a Star Trek episode, and give them, I don't know, extra stuff, bonuses, raises, income tax breaks or what have you. That's equity. We have the solution for injustices against people, and that's treating them equally. Now, that you can talk about that because you can't have a blind pilot. You can't treat all blind people the same. I don't know if you'd want somebody who has hand seizures to be your dental surgeon. So you have to talk about what that means in context. But we already have the tools, and the tools liberalism and the Enlightenment has provided us with those tools. You can't both have equity and equality. In fact, by definition, equitable systems are not equal. And that's the question that I've often asked people who've used those as synonyms. Give me an example of a sentence where the word equity can be substituted for the word equality, and the meaning of the sentence doesn't change. I don't think you can do that. And I don't think you can do that because that's why there's the word equity and equality. Excuse me. And if you want to learn more about that, if you want to drill down into the grievance studies literature, I would highly recommend James Lindsay's New Discourses Encyclopedia and look up the word equity and equality.
Yes, it's a good time to plug that. The New Discourses website is absolutely fantastic, and I recommend everyone go ahead and check it out. I'll go ahead and let Bruce take the mantle now.
Peter, I'd like to take the conversation towards religion and atheism for a moment, and I have a really fun spin on this that I think you and I will be able to speak on. One of the reasons that many of us got on board with ideas such as humanism and atheism is because we've seen how irrationality and the belief in bad ideas can bring about a great deal of harm. So we want to believe as many true things as possible and follow that line of thought. We see the issues nowadays with anti-vaxxers, COVID-19, religion, but to bring the conversation around to a subject that you and I both enjoy, we also see it in something as mundane as martial arts. We see a lot of parallels between martial arts and religion, like I was saying before, and there's, especially with Asian styles, there's a near-mythical founder who gets divine inspiration and puts his ideas out in the world. Now, in spite of people like Bruce Lee and how popular the UFC is, we still people just clinging to these ideas around the world. Like people still hold on to religion nowadays. And the most flagrant example I've recently seen are of a MMA fighter by the name of Xu Xiaodong, who's spreading MMA in China. Now, if you see him on YouTube, he regularly just crushes, unequivocally, just destroys these Tai Chi, Wing Chun, Xing Yi practitioners, and anything that claims to be functional in mysticism rather than the laws of physics. And we see people, rather than accepting these new methods of combat, just give Xu Xiaodong death threats for encroaching on quote-unquote treasured Chinese cultural traditions. Now, have you argued with people on these terms, and do you see the parallels?
That's what I talked about in my first Joe Rogan Experience episode. I think that the key is, again, what we've talked about, maybe an emerging theme, although I think this is only the second time this podcast, is that there's a corrective mechanism. There's a way to bring one's cognitions into alignment with reality. And the question is, how do they do that? So my guess is that when something is just so conspicuous and so obvious, like the failure of traditional martial arts in any system, not Chinese or Japanese, what have you, when it doesn't, you should check out the work of my Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu coach, Matt Thornton. He's the head of Straight Blast, Conor McGregor's Straight Blast, John Kavanaugh's Straight Blast, who's McGregor's coach.
Yes.
Yeah. So he's written extensively on this stuff. He'd be a great person for your podcast, by the way. And he has a new book that he just wrote. It's a very long book, a wonderful, phenomenal tome about violence. If you guys are interested in violence and martial arts, and he talks about the functional martial arts. But anyway, there's no question at all that there are parallels. My guess is that over time, and probably a very short period of time, if I were to guess, that people will realize, not just people, but there'll be a consensus view that traditional martial arts It's just total nonsense. But one of the things I will say that they do is they don't sell it as fighting. They'll sell it as respect, getting
Right.
good grades. You bring your
Right.
homework in, stuff like that. That's how they sell it. But then when you get in there, they change their tune entirely.
Right. Well, while we're on this parallels between martial arts and religion, one of the issues we see out there today is the prospect of reforming Islam and to make it to have that religion come in line with modern values in the same way that more or less Judaism and Christianity have to varying degrees. Now, Majid Nawaz is in favor of the process, but there are some in the ex-Muslim community that really aren't. And I wanted to run the scenario of the martial arts past and get your thoughts on this. I have a lot of respect for Matt Thornton's work, his aliveness paradigm, and how he wants to create martial arts scientists. I met him. I met and trained with him at a seminar once several years ago. Love his material. In one of his instructionals, he brings up an example in which during the 1960s we see boxing infiltrate karate tournaments, and they end up just cleaning house and knocking people out because their hands are just that much more functional. Now that forced an evolution in karate, and I think that's just how American kickboxing got started, because they were forced to learn boxing. They could not use their hands by keeping their hands behind the waist and doing that stuff. Now, if the training methods of kata, static stance practice, and just dead training methods are just discarded in favor of just conditioning, live training, and sparring, is it intellectually honest to say that American kickboxing is karate? And in parallel, when we're talking about Reform Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, isn't it just more appropriate to call them what they are? Just humanism with a very, very Abrahamic cultural flavor, and being religious in name only. And if we're going to go that far, is there any point to religious reform?
Wow, that is such an enormous question. I'm going to give you guys the gold star for asking the biggest, most difficult questions. Okay, so there were there were
Thanks,
three
Doc.
questions. There were there were three questions in that. I don't think that Judaism, maybe unless you talk about strictly Reform Judaism, but
Right.
Judaism has a lot of extremely bizarre. So let's just say that's what you're talking about. No, I don't think that those are just. I guess it depends how you define them as forms of humanism. I think, getting back to the martial arts thing, it depends on the training methodology. I did a podcast with a guy named Rokas, who was a black belt in
Aikido. Yeah, Rokas. I know Rokas.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. He was a black belt. He trained in straight blast for a while. He's a really super good guy.
Yeah.
And then he has this, I think it's called Martial Arts Journey, when he talks about his journey out of delusion until functional martial arts. The key there is aliveness. And aliveness is Matt's idea of training energy and motion, not energy like woo-woo energy, but you have a resisting opponent, someone who wants to win the fight. Now, obviously, you have to have some rules. You can't bring a chainsaw in, which, by the way, I should talk one more time. I have a thought experiment about the trans issue that deals with MMA. But I think that the key there is, what does it mean to train with aliveness? Now, what would be the analog in training with aliveness in religion? I don't think it has one. The closest thing they have is apologetics training, but I don't think it has an analog for that.
I was going to say morality and our discussion with objective morality, how to live your life in that regard. But please go ahead.
Well, it's okay. So that was a huge question. So then I'm trying to take it piece by piece. So, Majid Nawaz does believe that there can be reform in the Islamic world by, secular value separation of church and state, or mosque and state, or what have you. And he has written. I did a talk with the deputy U.S. director at Emory about this. Super good guy, super smart guy. I forget his name, Dr. somebody, but. So the question is how if you agree that ought to be the goal, and some people, I think Sarah Hayder from Ex-Muslims of North America, maybe somebody, I think Gad Sad is somebody on this side, so they don't believe that kind of reform is possible. So right. I will say that's way out of my area of expertise. I'm not a specialty in Middle East. I've studied the Quran with a tutor for years, but I'm in no way a specialist. I don't speak Arabic, so you'd have to find somebody else to talk to about the practicality or the feasibility bring those in alignment with secular values. I'm just not qualified.
Okay.
What are your thoughts on the idea that, this is something that I've struggled with quite a bit. The whole idea that reforming religion only brings us further away from having a genuine understanding of the philosophies and ethical frameworks of these people living during the writing of these books. And by reforming it and interpreting these scriptures liberally, we're just getting further away from this understanding.
Yeah, why do you think that's an important question?
Mainly, I guess, out of historical academic curiosity. So I think as a species, we need to be intellectually honest about history, about the philosophies of people who wrote the original texts, that sort of stuff.
Yeah, it's interesting. One of the things that you're seeing now with I'm going to try to weave together some disparate elements of our conversation with the Southern Baptists in the United States is that there was, I think it's called Resolution 19, in which is intersectionality indispensable for viewing the Christian gospel, the gospel of Christ. And there is absolutely no mention whatsoever of intersectionality in the Bible. There is no reference to social justice. I'm not a biblical scholar, but there's I don't think the word social is preceded by justice, but I don't know, it's a Google search away. And I've listened to some fascinating talks. I was just at a major Christian conference with 5,000 people in Atlanta, Georgia. I had dinner with James White at that conference, by the way. Something that would have been almost unthinkable 5 years ago. James White is one of the best, most famous living Christian apologists. But the question of whether or not there needs to be an intersectional lens to view the gospel is very bizarre to me. And it shows how again, weaving the conversation together, it shows that the social justice is really as Lindsay calls it, it's a universal solvent that destroys anything it touches. I do think that works have to be understood in their context. I just took a second read in my family since we've been in stay-at-home. We've been doing book clubs, and it was our turn. Everybody gets to recommend their own book. So I recommended my favorite science fiction book, which is Joe Hadelman's Forever War. And reading that a second time was fascinating to me. I hadn't read that in a long time, but to understand, have either of you guys read that book?
Unfortunately, no.
It's an astonishingly good book. But to read that book a second time with changing life circumstances and what have you, it was really interesting to think about, wow, the culture and the circumstance in which he wrote and why it's important to understand that, like during the Vietnam War and changing sexual mores. And I mean, it's just an astonishingly good book. But so to answer your question directly, I do think it's important to understand the historical context. Or for example, when it's in, a surah in the Quran, don't eat pork. Well, because the pork gives you trigonosis, raw pork. I mean, so, and we can't say cook your pork. So I do think that there are, particularly in religion, it's important to understand the context in which original pieces were written.
Peter, we've been asking a lot of questions that's been touching upon epistemology as a bedrock. I'd like to take the conversation towards exploring epistemology itself, especially in the context of the books that you and James have written. You've written How to Create Atheists and How to Have Difficult Conversations. Well, you've written those two books, and they're about pretty much describing how the Socratic method is used to get someone to explore lines of reasoning and to just why people hold the positions they hold. Because it's a Socratic method, I found, at least in my case, that it's a really good self-bullshit detector because we can't ask someone a question without listening to ourselves at first. And I find that, it explores our methods of epistemology, and we get to see firsthand if we're grounding our beliefs in evidence. But this is where things concern me. We had Dr. Shermer on our show once, and one of the questions I asked him was, look, what source of information can we reliably use nowadays to hem in our rationalism and how critical thinking is applied? And we hear that term thrown around so much, there's no real definition applied to it. So I've explicated my own. I want to get your thoughts on it. I define critical thinking as consisting of two pillars: rationalism, chaining premises together with an aim towards a conclusion, and empiricism, the evidence and bedrock for the reasons. Would you add anything to that, or am I completely off?
Well, first of all, let me say I wouldn't. If I tell you you're completely off, I'm not sure you should. I don't know how much weight you should give that. But in early 1990s, 1990, 1992, the American Philosophical Association gave what's been the defining definition of critical thinking, and it has two things that are really interesting. One is a skill set, and the skill set is the thing you pretty much defined: a skill set and a method, a mechanism for success. But the other thing that almost nobody teaches and no one talks about, but if you really read the report well, which I have several times, and the subsequent literature that emerged from it, it's that it's an attitude. It's an attitudinal disposition that people possess. And I think that doesn't get anywhere near as much press because it's very difficult, if not impossible, to test. Someone can always lie about it, et cetera, et cetera. But that attitude of being trustful of reason, of being willing to reconsider, which we talked about before when we talked about deriving moral values, those are the indispensable bedrocks for critical rationality, for rationality and critical thinking. And so how do we help people value those things? So here's one way to think about it. If you have the skill set and you don't have the attitude, you can make your epistemological situation worse. Because if you have the skill set, and we see this with Mensa, the high IQ society, people who believe ridiculous things, and this is in Shermer's book of The Believing Brain, why do smart people believe weird things? And I published a piece based upon Shermer's insight in the Philosopher's Magazine called Polluted Departments, about philosophy departments who've taken up the mantle of intersectionality, and they're diluted. And the reason is, if the single greatest insight in all critical thinking is that smarter people are better at rationalizing bad ideas. Most
Right.
people don't understand what the word rationalizing means. It means giving good reasons for bad ideas. But groups of smart people are better still at rationalizing bad ideas. That's a method, that's a way that a lens you can look through to understand why intersectionality has taken over the academy and why philosophy departments, which should be the gatekeepers of reason, have fallen. Not just fallen asleep, but just fallen. And they're now operating in service to an ideology that's parasitized the academy. Well, the reason for that is because groups of smart people are better at rationalizing bad ideas. And the reason for that is unless you possess the attitudinal disposition, if you just possess the skill set, you're actually going to make your epistemic situation worse. So you need to have the attitude. And then from those attitudes, the skill sets, inference, analysis, explanation, et cetera, those things are pretty easy to teach. They actually don't take long at all. But the attitude is something totally different. Some people believe that it can't be taught. My opinion, you can take this for what it's worth, is that that's false. It's taught through a line in the literature called pro-social modeling. That is, you want to model those behaviors, particularly if you're in front of a class, someone asks you a question, make sure you make a point of saying, I don't know if you don't know. You don't pretend to know things you don't know. You don't bullshit people, etc. So I think that document is as relevant today as it was when it came out in the early 90s.
But in order to be able to, a premise behind those books is to be able to have decent conversations with people and to be able to reach across the divide. But my concern is like we're increasingly polarized, and we have liberals and conservatives just favoring their own sources of information of truth, their own news networks, and just having their suspicions levied towards institutions that are hostile to their interests. And it just seems to me that we've lost the ability to argue from first principles. Now, I don't think that we're all the way down to, or arguing down to René Descartes' I think, therefore I am. We're probably just a little above that, but not by much. If we can't rely on our news networks, if we can't rely on some central source of truth, where do we get our first principles from if we want to reset where the right and the left have just completely taken us awry?
Well, I have my own opinion about that. Since you asked me, I'll tell you. first thing, I think you're right. You're technically correct in that we've lost our ability to have conversations, which was a thrust of the book. But what I think is more important than that, let me rephrase that. And what I think is more important than that is not necessarily that we've lost our ability to have conversations, which we have. We see the worst models for it, but it's that we don't value it anymore. We don't value talking across divides or talking to people with whom we have substantive moral and political disagreements. In fact, we think we're better people for it, or we think we're better people, and this gets to the pronouns in the bio. You know, you put pronouns in your bio, you think you're a better person because you launch some kind of a tirade against someone who has maybe even a slight difference of opinion. So the question becomes, so repeat the question again, because there's a lot there.
I think the simplest way to put it was that René Descartes pretty much gave everyone a basis to start from, in order for epistemology to acquire to understand truth. And his Cogito ergo sum was a bedrock from which to launch from. In modern society, without if everyone just hews to their own news networks, and we cannot get everyone to say like Reid Quillette as a balance point between both sides, where do we get epistemic truth from? No ifs, ands, or buts.
I'll give you a tool you can do, but again, the tool completely relies upon a willingness to revise one's beliefs, a willingness to reconsider one's position. And that tool is something I've written about extensively, published about it both in the popular press. If you read Skeptic, I have a little piece called The Feasibility, I think, and I published a piece of educational philosophy and theory. It's taken up, it's the most pages in my most recent book, the mode, if you will. So that's called The Feasibility. So you have to ask yourself, under what conditions could a belief be false? I think this is, in my opinion, the most, not one of the most, but the most important questions one can ever ask oneself, aside from what kind of life ought I to lead. So you're asking yourself, you have fake news, you have information sources, you have reality tunnels, you have ideological sinkholes that people fall into. Sorry, I'm walking on the street and all these kids are yelling at me. I apologize. So I can't go in my house because everybody's home because of the pandemic. Anyway, so if we need to train people, we need to, and maybe train isn't the right word, but we need to teach people why they should value belief revision, why that should be a core principle of one's intellectual life. And we need to, if we can do that, then all these other things will fall. Like if we can teach people that that's a value that they ought to hold and that value is rationally derivable, then the next thing, the next question one could ask is, well, how do we teach people that? Like what tools can we give them? And defeasibility is key for that. Okay, so someone holds a belief very strongly. Under what conditions would you be willing to provide that belief? I'm not saying I can provide those conditions or that they even exist, but what would it look like? And they tell you. Maybe this is a little into the weeds, but it answers your question directly. If it's too granular, let me know.
No, absolutely.
There are basically
Go ahead.
There are only four things people can say to you. There are no conditions. They could tell you what the conditions are. They can tell you conditions that are wildly implausible, or they can say, I don't know. So like, under what conditions would you believe, going back in your atheism question, that Jesus rose from the dead? Or Jesus didn't rise from the dead, say you're talking to Christians. Well, the bones of Christ would be wildly implausible. Here are the conditions, I'd have to know, and whatever they are. Or then someone would say, well, Jesus, I really don't know what those conditions are. So once you get that, once you train people once people have certain attitudinal dispositions, they value the right things that lead them to their intellectual flourishing, then the only thing is to give them tools, and the feasibility is chief in that tool set.
I see. and being able to train that is just I take the analogies back to martial arts so much because I see so many parallels here. It's like you want to take a style and see just how well it holds up against realistic pressure. And we've seen that happening with the alive arts like kickboxing, jiu-jitsu, and whatnot in the ring. We don't see that with old school karate styles or whatnot.
That's a wonderful connection you've made. And anybody who's seriously trained in jiu-jitsu, to me, jiu-jitsu is just as philosophical as anything else. Anybody who's seriously trained in jiu-jitsu sees those connections, understands the corrective mechanism. So I think that intuition is absolutely correct. And I would encourage people once this whatever we're in ends to think about doing some jiu-jitsu, if for no other reason than bracketing all the keep you in shape stuff, but just thinking about it in terms of a philosophical activity.
Well, it's definitely a wonderful art, and what I like about it is, like as you said, it's self-correcting, and it does not let you bullshit yourself.
Yeah, you can't fake it because there's genuine expertise. And I also believe, just as you're a brown belt, so you would roll with me and you could probably figure it out that I'm a purple belt within 10 seconds, I'm guessing. You could probably figure out someone who has no jiu-jitsu experience whatsoever, I'm guessing, within 5 seconds. And you could probably figure out someone who's a seasoned black belt in maybe 15 seconds.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes.
Right. So there's genuine expertise in that. I also think that there's genuine expertise in reasoning. There's genuine expertise in a whole suite of a whole range of cognitive activities which come bundled in certain suites. But what ought to come prior to that is the attitudinal disposition and the focus on epistemology. Are the methods that I'm using, can I rely upon these methods of knowledge acquisition? How confident? Belief is also not binary. It's not 100 and it's not on, off, yes, no. I'm more confident of some things. I'm more confident that the world existed before I was born. And I would argue to you that I could actually rationally define that. Charles Sanders Peirce, mentioned him again, his criticism of Descartes is, in order for you to even say, I think, therefore I am, there had to be a pre-existing linguistic community. Right, or else you couldn't even make that utterance. So I'm very confident that something existed before I was born. I'm 100% confident. I'm as confident in that as the fact that I exist.
Mm-hmm. That's good. Well, Peter, I want to thank you for coming on the podcast. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thanks for giving us your time.
Well, thanks, guys. I appreciate it, and you can find me on Twitter at Peter Boghossian, and my book is How to Have Possible Conversations, and have a lot of cool stuff hopefully coming out pretty soon too, so we'll see.
Peter, if I could sneak in one last question.
Yeah.
A few years ago, Sam Harris was going to write a book, Letters to a Young Liberal, but he decided not to follow through with the project, and I think you said it in some kind of interview that you were going to pick it up.
Yeah. I asked Sam about that if I could take it, and he said I could. He gave me his permission to take that, and then Trump got elected, and that kind of changed things. In retrospect, it was probably more reason, not less reason, to write the book, because I don't think liberalism ever lost its way, but I think liberals lost their way. They became a good portion of the left, and when I know that's a difference between the left and liberals, but they became what they hate, kind of totalitarian thugs.
Yes.
And they had values, invasive values that really latched on to some really important principles of treating people with decency and kindness and respect and giving everyone equal opportunities. And it's really tragic what's happened. And I don't think, like Helen Pluckrose, I don't think that the solution is, and this is the disagreement with my good friend Dave Rubin, I don't think that the solution is to abandon those and go to the right. I think that the solution is to say we need to get back to productive politics. We're happy to work with people from the right, but we need to clean our own house. I am increasingly pessimistic that has any chance of happening. And I think we're already seeing, which I predicted for years, a collapse of the American university system. Right. I don't think that the disciplines spewing out utter toxic nonsense based upon methodologies that are phantasmagoric, for lack of a better word. I don't see those people capable of self-policing. I see them looking at the university as a kind of way to indoctrinate people into a very narrow set of ideologies. So I'm not very optimistic whatsoever when it comes to the academy or self-reform in liberalism.
Well, one of the reasons I'm asking you about that book is because I think in that interview you phrased that it would be a tactical nuclear strike on bad ideas. I think that we really do need that tactical nuclear strike now. Things seem to be clearing up, but I think that strike would definitely help get things back in order. Are you still in the process of writing that book? Is it still on the table, or?
No, it's on the table. In fact, I've been thinking about it more and more lately. I don't know, to be blunt, I don't want to overshare, but I don't really know what I'm going to do. I should have gone up for promotion years ago. I never do because I always think I'm going to be fired. Now, I'm not sure if the university is going to exist. It certainly won't exist in its present form in even a year from now. COVID has just expedited its demise.
Right.
I don't know what the future is going to hold for me, but I don't know. It's a very odd thing. It's like if I were to do that, it would be because I thought it created what Daniel Dennett calls a contribution of abiding significance. One of the things, there's a wonderful little piece that Dennett wrote about Chemess, Chmess. If you Google Dennett and Chemess, it's a lovely, one of the most important pieces, in my opinion, in the last decade. And he talks about making a contribution of abiding significance. I think that letters to young liberals would be, if done right, and I would write it for my son, who does. I think it would just be a lovely way to go. But the other thing Dennett talks about that book in that article is, if it's not worth doing, it's not worth doing well. We see that with fake martial arts or Chinese martial arts or traditional martial arts, maybe better. If it's not worth doing, it's not worth doing well. But here's the kicker. If it's not worth doing, not only is it not worth doing well, but it's actually worse for you than if you didn't do it at all. It's a very, very hard concept to explain to somebody. So if you remember, you said about the boxing and people keeping their hands down, you'd be better off to not train yourself, to not train at all, than you would be to train keeping your hands down.
Well, I think a more flagrant example in that area would be like if you want to learn knife defense, and if you want to take your knife defenses from something like Filipino martial arts that are almost certainly not trained with the same kind of aliveness paradigm. If you don't know anything, when you come up against a knife, you're not going to run. You're going to deal with someone who's most likely going to seriously stab you.
And,
yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
It's funny because I have a black belt in stick and knife fighting, but. And I realized subsequent to that, a lot of the stuff that I was learning was bullshit. And then when I went down to the Santa Fe in New Mexico to fight some of the Dog Brothers and got the living shit kicked out of me, it was a very, very, very interesting. But I think that the reason that I was mentioning that in martial arts is it's kind of more obvious to see that how training to do something makes your situation worse than if you didn't do it at all. But I think it's the same with certain areas of philosophy or certain areas of grievance studies. You would be better off if you never took a women's studies class at all, because it trains you to think about ways in the world that are untethered to reality. It trains you to pick out and spot grievances and microaggressions and be triggered and cultivate a kind of epistemic and cognitive vulnerability that you wouldn't have had you not had the class in the first place. But it's less obvious to see those things because they're not physical manifestations in cages of people, one victor, at the end, one guy emerging from the cage. It's more of a slow cognitive and psychological deterioration that people face when they take these classes. And I realize that this is going to be extraordinarily controversial, but at some point there's a critical mass of people who hate you and it really doesn't matter anymore. I'm not so sure the demise of the American university system will be a bad thing.
We're probably heading to online universities in any case. So yeah, I think there's something to be said about that. Yes.
Yeah. So why would we want to prop up institutions that cull diverse voices out in the name of diversity, that pump out lines of literature that are completely absurd, and public policy decisions are based upon those, that not only are they unevidence-based, they're they're completely ideologically based, and the public policy decisions we think are going to lead to our flourishing don't. We now have a situation, we have what Habermas calls a legitimation crisis. We have a crisis of the fucking lunatic in the White House. We have a crisis of our institutions, our academic institutions, our judiciary, our legislative branch. So we have the WHO, the Southern Poverty Law Center. You mentioned Majid Nawaz. We have a crisis of confidence in our institutions. And the way to get past that crisis of confidence, it's actually not that complicated. In fact, it's extremely simple, but nobody wants to do it because they don't possess the attitudinal dispositions like being trustful of reason and being willing to revise your beliefs.
Yes.
Right? So, the situation with fixing the academy is not complicated. In fact, I went into the former dean's office and I told her what to be done. She was not pleased to hear it.
Well, I don't imagine many people would be. But...
Well, yeah, because there's something about, in that case, it's a complex array of financial factors too, in which you get paid to. It's a long story, but so that's the situation in which we find ourselves, right? We have a crisis of confidence. When the shit hits the fan with this pandemic, nobody is really asking themselves, what about the race of the researchers, and we got to have so many black people on there. No one gives a shit about that. They just want a vaccine. Right. So what does that mean for their ideology? Well, maybe either it shows you that they don't actually believe this stuff in the first place, or every single thing they're talking about, they don't think it matters.
Well, it completely undercuts it in the face of this pandemic with something this flagrant, and it should ideally get people to take a look back and saying, what the hell am I doing?
Well, yeah, because they're harboring a belief system about reality that the architects of the belief system themselves. The whole architecture of the belief system is predicated upon. It's not even like houses. It's not even like a house of cards. It's just a complete fabrication. It makes shit up wholesale.
Definitely.
Well, Peter, I want to thank you again for coming on the podcast. It's been an absolute honor to talk about these sorts of topics. It's great to finally have you on the podcast.
Oh, well, thanks, man. I appreciate the chat, and you guys, you were good from our walk. I walked around, got to talk to you guys. You made me think. That's good. Sorry if my answers were long. You guys asked some pretty big questions.
One of the things we absolutely had to ask you about, like Vincent and I both share a passion for studying morality and being able to ground it in objective reality. So you are absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much.
Oh, right on, guys. Well, I appreciate it, and thanks for having me on, and it was a real pleasure, and I'll talk to you guys later.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Thinking Out Loud. If you liked this podcast, be sure to subscribe for more content. We have consistently great conversations with people like Genetically Modified Skeptic, Lloyd Evans, and James Lindsay. Be sure to follow me on Twitter at Latent Physicist. Also follow the podcast Twitter at BPTOLcast. As always, it was a pleasure to serve you, and I hope to see you in the next podcast.